This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest reviewer on the Apple Podcast Store. Thank you, Notita, for the kind words that you had to say. You too can rate and review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. You can rate the podcast on Spotify and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. If you would like an ad-free experience of the podcast, please become a supporter at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. Remember, we have your Graceful Atheist and Secular Grace themed items at the TeePublic merchandise store. You will find the link in the show notes. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. Arlene interviews today's guest, Mandi. Mandi grew up in a Messianic Jewish environment. She eventually moved to Israel and took on a more traditional Jewish faith, and really enjoyed the community within the Jewish community. She began to see some problems and eventually deconverted and now considers herself an agnostic atheist. Here is Arlene interviewing Mandi.
Hi, Mandi. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm excited. You and I have chatted off and on. We're in the same state. We have not met, but we are nearish each other. And so it's been nice to get to know you, and I'm excited to hear your story. So usually how we start is just tell us about your religious upbringing of your childhood.
Okay. I grew up in Georgia, and I am the child of a Jewish mother, and my dad is not Jewish. And they decided, really because of my prompting, when I was in kindergarten, I came home from school and I said, why does everyone go to church? Because again, we lived in Georgia, Bible Belt. And they said, well, we don't go because you're Jewish, and we Jews don't do that. And so I said, okay, I guess I just accepted it. But I think now that I have a kindergartner of my own, I guess they were feeling some parental guilt or something. So they decided to look for some type of a solution. And what they decided to do was to start attending something called a Messianic synagogue, which is, it's actually in from my perspective now, it's really not a synagogue. It is a congregation that mixes, it's mostly Christian, and they mix some Jewish elements into it, some Jewish tradition. And that's where they decided to start visiting. They chose that because my mom, she was, she's from Brooklyn. She's very culturally Jewish. She would never have gone to a church. And my father he's from Georgia. He was from a Christian background, and this, the fact that their beliefs were essentially Christian made him comfortable. So they decided, let's try this out. So we started attending this congregation when I was 5 or 6 years old. And if you were to just walk into this place, it would not look like a church. There were no crosses or any kind of outward Christian symbols. In fact, the whole goal of the Messianic movement is really to make Jews comfortable with Christianity. So they would avoid using overtly Christian terms. Like, we would not say Jesus. We would say, instead of Jesus, they would say, oh, well, his name was Yeshua, which has a more, it's a Hebrew name. It would just potentially make mostly unaffiliated, uneducated Jews feel more comfortable. And when I say uneducated, I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm just saying someone who didn't grow up with like a solid Jewish education. That's mainly the people they attract. And they also attract a lot of people who are in a mixed Jewish-Christian marriage. In fact, most of the people who attend Messianic congregations aren't Jewish at all, but somehow are trying to discover like the Jewish roots of Christianity, or they'll call it Hebrew roots. But when they did get a Jewish person to walk through the doors, it's almost like they got really excited, and they almost felt like, we got somebody. And so they would almost immediately put them in forward facing positions so that they would have more of a Jewish presence.
Wow.
Like they had my mother working in the gift shop very quickly after we started going there. Other people that I know were, regardless of their Hebrew ability, were put into the service. The structure of the congregation, they tried to use Hebrew liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it was still focused around a sermon, and there was still, even though they were combining Jewish things, there was still like this altar call and things that Christians would be familiar with. Um, because indeed that was really the goal, was to get Jews to accept Jesus. Um, it was actually the Messianic groups were started by Christians in order to proselytize Jews.
Oh, wow. That's so icky. Like, that's just so gross. I had no idea. I just assumed it was Jewish people who had become Christian or had accepted Jesus. I don't know the right way to say that.
Yeah, yeah,
And started it. Wow.
mhm,
I'm not surprised. Oh, I am
yes.
surprised. I don't know how to say that, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I didn't really view it like that, at the time, and neither did
Hmm.
my parents. The couple who started the congregation I grew up at, it was one of the larger ones. Um, and the man was Jewish, and his wife wasn't. And that's kind of that was pretty typical for those kinds of places.
Hmm.
Um, I immediately, I mean, I was a little kid, but I just, I just loved it. I loved every second of being there. I had um, a really positive experience there as a young child. I also read from an early age, and so I was looking for answers. And if I couldn't get my parents to explain it to me, I was going to be finding it in a book. So one of the first things I did, um, I was in first grade, and I really was, I guess, dealing with the whole confusion of having a Jewish parent and a Christian parent. And so I found this book in the library, and it was called "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret" by Judy Blume.
Yeah.
Now, other girls might have picked it up because they were interested in, development and everything. But the reason I was interested in the book is because the character has a Jewish and a Christian parent.
Hmm.
And that's really what I was looking for. And then my teacher was like, calling home, "Do you know what your first grader is reading?"
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is young for Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret.
But I promise it was just the religious part I was interested in at the time.
Hmm.
So, and then I remember spending a good amount of time in the library just trying to find books about Judaism because I was so interested in it. At that point, my mom's mom had already passed away. I didn't really have anyone to ask except for my mother. And so all the Jewish books I can get my hands on as a little kid were um, novels about the Holocaust, or, books about the Holocaust. And so I became like real obsessed, which probably freaked my mom out a little bit because it's a heavy topic for
Yeah.
a young kid. But that's what I would read about as much as possible. And so we continued to go to the congregation. I have a younger sister, 3 years younger than me.
Hmm.
We were super involved, and really, I never ever called myself a Christian, um, although it's 100% what I was. If you're looking at like what I believed or what I was taught to believe, um, I would call myself a Messianic Jew, and I was super proud of that. We started celebrating before we had gone to the congregation. We celebrated the only holiday we celebrated was Hanukkah. Um, And in fact, that's really I only knew I was Jewish when I was very little because we had a menorah next
Hmm.
to our Christmas tree because we were a mixed family. And I had a Star of David, and that was it. But once we started going to the congregation, if you don't know so much about Judaism, like my mom didn't know about a lot of these holidays, even though she grew up culturally Jewish. We started celebrating all kinds of holidays. And I just thought it was the greatest thing ever. My dad went along with it and was supportive. He was just interested in, coming from a Baptist background, he was interested in my mom being saved.
Ah,
Um,
yes.
so around this time, I had gone on a field trip, and I think my mom was um, a chaperone. And one of the teachers, prayed the prayer with her on this field trip. We were at a park for lunch, and so even the teachers kind of had, I guess, had their eye on my mom because knowing she's Jewish, you kind of have a target sometimes for people to want to convert you. So anyway, she said that prayer, and uh, we just continued going to this congregation for years. And I got super involved in the youth group there. Uh, Most of my friends, my really close knit friends, were from there. And when I got a bit older, when I was a teenager, they started having these, or they always had them, but I started going to these conferences because it's like such a small group compared to like other Christian denominations. We didn't really get to meet a lot of other Messianics where we lived. So we'd go to these conferences. There was a big one every year up in Pennsylvania. And we went to some in Florida. And that was like a big thing to look forward to. And that's how I ended up meeting a lot of other friends from other parts of the country.
So for the most part, you enjoyed, did you call it synagogue or did you call it church? You called it synagogue?
I called it temple, which
Okay, temple.
temple, yeah, is what we called it. That's a word that maybe Reform or maybe conservative Jews would use that term, but that's kind of where they got it from.
So you enjoyed it and you believed it. Is this all the way into college, young adult years, or are you high school youth group?
Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, I started asking questions and becoming a little bit more critical of what I was being taught. I really wish I had a copy of this letter. I remember writing the youth leader a letter with all of my concerns, and he was basically like, he wrote me back and was like, he was dismissive of them, and for some reason I wasn't able to kind of push past that. So I know it started then, but I don't remember what specific issues I was dealing with. So later on, when I was in a college and career age group, um, my parents were having some problems at home. It got increasingly chaotic. I feel like I had a normal childhood up until a point, and then it just got really bad at home. And it got so bad that I ended up moving in with my friend's family. One of my good friends, she had actually moved overseas for university, and I moved in with her parents, which I had known since I was like a little kid. So happens to be that this man, her father, was the Bible study teacher for the youth group I was in, and it was college age and career age, like 20 somethings basically in this group. So I had moved in with them. I appreciated them at the time, opening their home to me. Um, and my parents, they were very supportive in that they let us have the flexibility to, make certain religious decisions. But my parents weren't as into maybe the theology of things as I was. I think I took everything to heart. I'm a pretty serious person. And so I just want to go back a little bit and say, like for instance, I started struggling again with certain aspects of being Jewish and Christian at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It was at that point I had gone to one of these big conferences that the Messianic movement holds. It was down in Orlando, Florida. And it was at that point that I went to a class and I discovered that there were certain groups of Messianics that were more Jewishly observant than my group was. And that was really fascinating to me. So when I say observant, I'm talking about they were trying to keep the kosher dietary laws. They were trying to keep the Sabbath, keep Shabbat. For us, the way I was raised, we had our meetings on Friday night and or Saturday, but we had no concept of like setting the entire day aside, and that it has certain spiritual aspects, and like that it's a set apart family time. We didn't have that idea, and we would say, oh, we keep biblically kosher. So what that meant was that we didn't eat pork or shellfish or other animals that you're not supposed to eat according to Leviticus. But we would have no problem like having a cheeseburger in an Applebee's, for example. Like
Oh, okay. Yeah.
we didn't like buy kosherly slaughtered meat, and we didn't observe what they call the rabbinic tradition of separating meat and dairy. So it was a step towards kosher, but it wasn't keeping kosher at all. So anyway, when I met this other group, they were trying to live almost as if they were observant Orthodox Jews, while still holding on to the belief that Jesus was the Messiah. So I ended up going to a class, and it was a leader from one of those groups, and I had some questions, and afterwards the guy said, oh, look, I've got to go to lunch, but the guy sitting behind you can answer any question you have. And I turned around and I met him, and this is my husband. This is who I'm married to today.
Oh, that's so fun.
So, yeah. So now he was part of this group that was trying to be more observant, and it happens to be that I don't think any of those people were born Jewish at all. So it was a whole bunch of non-Jewish people trying to live as if they were observant Orthodox Jews, while holding on to certain elements of Christianity. And some of them, they didn't believe necessarily in the Trinity or things like that, but they did believe that, Jesus / Yeshua was the Messiah. And so afterwards, we ended up talking and comparing notes, and I was really fascinated by this. So I ended up spending more time with Andy, who's now my husband, but at the time, his group of people would like get together for the Sabbath, and they would look for kosher symbols and things like that on food. And I was like, whoa, this is different. And he introduced me. He lived in South Georgia. I lived in North Georgia. And so he said, you should really check out, there's a whole religious Jewish community in Atlanta, and you'd probably like to spend some time there and maybe attend some classes or come for a Sabbath meal. And I was like, okay. So I was a little scared, but I was like, all right, we'll check it out. So now it's very common in an Orthodox Jewish community for them to host a Sabbath meal, invite guests, and that's totally normal. But the whole idea of going to a stranger's home that I had never met before, it kind of intimidated me. And I was told most of my life, don't have anything to do with Orthodox Jews because they don't believe in Jesus and they don't have the truth and they will trick you. And I was told a whole bunch of negative things about them. So, but my curiosity overwhelmed me, and I ended up going anyway.
So you're a young adult, you've met Andy, you went to this thing in Atlanta. How did that go? How was that experience?
It was really cool. We went to this lady's home, and from her perspective, I have no idea what she thought about us, but I think they're pretty used to having non-affiliated Jewish people come and experience this. I think they're more puzzled by why is this non-Jewish boy wanting to come and experience Shabbos? But for me, they were more than welcoming, very, very nice. I came and I saw we lit Shabbat candles, which is a traditional Jewish thing to do, something I was familiar with as well. And we walked to the synagogue, and I experienced my first Orthodox Jewish synagogue service, which was very different for me because Um, Men and women sit separately. There is a dividing wall between men and women called a mechitza. Um, I just felt like I was wearing some type of a sign on my forehead that I didn't belong there and someone was going to question me or kick me out. But it wasn't like that at all. Everyone was very, very nice. Afterwards, I was invited over to another family's home to have dinner with them. And so I said, I agreed, and we decided to go. Now, one thing about Orthodox Jewish life is you don't drive on the Sabbath. So um, I actually knew that, and so I had parked down the road and walked to the synagogue because I didn't want to break any rules openly. Um, anyway, so we walked to this family's home. It ended up being a really long walk. I didn't expect that, and anyway, we got there, and the people that they set us up with were Hasidic Jews. They had a little bit of a different dress. You might imagine, like you might have seen something on TV with long black coats, tall furry hats, long beards. So I was a little bit intimidated, but they were very friendly and very nice. It turned out that the people that we visited their very first night ended up becoming very close friends of ours down the road. But it went well.
Good. Okay. So, at any point, are you questioning or having anything happen, or is this just like life is going well, things are working well, Judaism, Messianic Christianity, whatever you called it at the time, is working well? And
Um, well, Andy was challenging my beliefs in that um, he was moving quickly away from anything Christian, and um, you know, tried to convince me that it's not a correct belief to believe that Jesus was God. That
oh wow,
so
okay,
that was a big move away from Orthodox Christianity, I guess, and but he was still holding on to the idea that he was the Messiah, but that the correct way to live would be to live more like Jesus would have lived as a Jewish person. And in the mind of these people who are thinking this way, that would have included not only laws that were in the Bible, but laws that were rabbinic in nature that came along later, the customs and traditions that the Jewish people have developed over centuries. So that was happening as well. In the meantime, the people, the family I was living with, were becoming increasingly concerned for me because they saw some changes in my behavior. They saw me um, stop. I started wearing like only dresses and only skirts, and I started taking on some outward observances that are common in the Orthodox world. And I think they saw some of my reading material, which was a lot of Jewish books. And I had a bedroom that I was renting from them, and so they would like slip books under my door, apologetics type books, like. So they were worried for me. I didn't have the greatest relationship with my parents at the time. They were going through their own thing, but I started. I started really questioning things, but in the meantime, I started dating Andy, and he was convinced he'll say to this day, as soon as I met you, I knew we were going to get married, but I didn't really get that message. So, or I got it, but it was a few years later. So anyway, he proposed, we got engaged. I was young. I was in college. My parents were like, no, you've got to finish college. Don't do this. And the people, the family I was living with, were also concerned. Um, in the long run, it ended up being it was all too much. I was taking on these observances, not really because I was convinced of them, but really for him. And that was just, it was too much too fast. And um, it was a scary thing because if you think about it from the Christian perspective, like he's playing with apostasy, and um, that was, you know, the whole hell thing kind of freaked me out. I thought he was going to eventually convert to Judaism and leave Christianity behind 100%. So we ended up going our separate ways, broke up, and I didn't see him for another 5 years.
Oh, wow.
In the meantime, I continued living with the family. I was going to college. And eventually, things started to fall apart for me with the religion. I didn't have the word deconstruction at the time because this
Yeah.
was like in the early 2000s. And I had picked up a copy of this booklet on one of my visits to the Orthodox community of Atlanta. But at the time, when I first picked it up, I was like, oh, I'm going to put this on the shelf, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I know Mormons call it the shelf, but I mean, like, literally, I put it on the shelf and I was like, I'll deal with this another day. Um, so anyway, but what it was like it was an anti-missionary guide, and it was a book written specifically for people like me, or for people who were trying to convince Jews to become Christians. And it basically, in a very, very few amount of pages, um, explained that this was there was no way that Jesus could have been the Messiah. Um, and I picked that book up thinking, I'm going to disprove this and, you know, use this against them one day, because I was convinced of the truth of my belief system. But anyway, I put it aside. Well, eventually some things happened, and I decided I think I'm going to read that book now. So this has been a few years since I picked it up. Um, I had already had that experience with the Orthodox Jewish community of Atlanta. And while there was a lot of positive things, it was just overwhelming at the time. So I started reading, and I think it was probably, I feel like I stayed up all night at least once or twice reading through this book. And it was just so obvious. Like it just kind of all fell apart for me really, really fast. Uh, what I'm talking about is, from the Jewish perspective, when Jews say Messiah and when Christians say Messiah, they often mean two different things. From the Jewish perspective, a Messiah is not a god, not someone to be worshipped, but a king who will fulfill um, certain prophecies or ideas. But those included making the world, like, you know, peace on earth, basically, and a rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and um, worldwide acceptance of one God. And you can look out your window and say, oh, these things haven't happened yet. Um, so, you know, how could the Messiah have come? And then it also, the book that I was reading went through how Christians claim that Jesus fulfilled hundreds and hundreds of prophecies in the New Testament, but if you examine them very closely, you realize these actually aren't prophecies, and he didn't fulfill them. And also that he came from the wrong genealogy to be qualified to even be the Messiah. So based on those grounds, I was slowly opening my eyes to the fact that, oh, what I was taught might not be true, and that was a really scary place to be in.
Yeah.
I didn't want to change all of my beliefs. I didn't want to leave everything. That was not my goal at all. But I had no other place to turn, so I went to my Bible study teacher, which was the father of the family I was living with, and I started asking questions on our little college and career class. And I thought, you know, this is a safe space. I can ask these kinds of questions. But I quickly discovered it was not such a safe space to ask these questions. I was told, I mean, it was just met with like real frustration. And I wasn't trying to be antagonistic. I'm not that type of a person, or at least I really wasn't that type of a person back then. Um, but I was told I can come to class if I'd like, but I had to keep my mouth shut. I couldn't, I couldn't bring any of this up anymore. Like, he was so frustrated with me that at one point, like, he just got up, slammed his Bible down, and walked out of the room. Like it was so tense. And I was really just wanting someone to convince me of the truth of my the beliefs I grew up in.
Yeah.
So eventually I stopped attending that class. I really was looking for answers, and I was becoming increasingly worried that, oh no, oh no, oh no, that sinking feeling like this isn't true. And I had believed it so wholeheartedly. So I went to the leader of the congregation, who, remember, he was a Jewish man. He did not have any sort of Jewish education, although they called themselves rabbis. It's really disingenuous. But he was very convinced of he was very sure that I would come right back. He's like, "Oh, we have the truth. You'll come back. Um, yeah, I can't answer your questions, but go talk to so and so, and he can answer your questions." And then they didn't have the answers, and I was just pushed off. And so I realized that there was something wrong, and um, I was told, whatever you do, don't talk to those Orthodox Jews, because they'll guide you in the wrong way. I decided to anonymously write a letter to another Messianic leader that did not personally know me and ask all of my questions. I was really, really seeking. And she wrote back, again, dismissing most of my questions, and said, just encouraging me not to look for answers from anyone else other than that group. So at that point I was like, what are they hiding? So I decided to get online, and I found a rabbi online, and I started sending him questions. And I was pleasantly surprised to realize that he was okay with that. He was like, oh, you're a Jewish person who was raised Messianic and you have questions? Great. He said, and he also encouraged me to keep asking questions of the Messianics. He didn't want me to stop talking to them or anything like that. He said, "Oh, questions are good. Ask away. If I can help you, I'll send you some verses to read." He understood that from our perspective, we didn't we took the Bible seriously in one regard, but we did not take the rabbinic tradition to be like the Word of God or anything. So he was pointing me to certain Bible verses that would help me help convince me of Judaism, but by just using the verses from the Bible. What ended up happening was I stopped attending the congregation as much. The people I lived with noticed, and they pulled me aside, and the mother of the family sat me down, and she gave me this whole talk, basically telling me, she gave me a whole parable about that she made up about, what if you were engaged to the most wonderful man in the world, and then the bridesmaid started whispering to you that he was really a bad guy, and you listened to these bridesmaids, and you ended up losing out on marrying the love of your life. Basically, this was an analogy that she was trying to Jesus being the bridegroom type of a thing. And she told me, if you do this, you're playing with fire and you will go to hell.
Oh, wow.
And I was terrified. I mean, that's a scary thing. So at that point, I prayed and I said, "God, can you just be patient with me? I've got to figure this out. Just be patient with me." At the time, I was best friends with this guy, and he kind of saw the direction I was going in, and he said, "Even if you end up living in an Orthodox community and you're wearing a wig and you have 17 children or whatever, I'll still be your friend. I'll be your friend no matter what." And I said, but what if they tell you to stop talking to me? And he said, "Well, if they do that, then I have to obey my spiritual authority." And this is kind of, I never would have described my upbringing as cultish, but once you start to leave, you see certain aspects of that. And, that just how much control they have over people. when I left, it all kind of fell apart overnight. I was literally kicked out of the place I was living in. They told me they didn't want me to be a bad influence on their children who were still living in the home. Like literally threw my stuff on the front lawn. Out, like get out. I ended up going to live with my mother again. My best friend stopped talking to me overnight because indeed they did tell him, don't talk to her. My sister and her new husband also stopped talking to me. I was not allowed in their home. I could not see their baby because Satan had obviously influenced me. Like they demonized me pretty bad. So um, I found myself in a very short amount of time living back with my mother, with absolutely no friends anymore that would talk to me.
Yeah.
And I was I was really searching for, like, what am I going to do next? Because I had already had a bit of experience with the Orthodox community of Atlanta, I just saw so much truth and beauty in that. I decided, that's where I'm going to go next. It never occurred to me that maybe I should give it some time and take a break. I needed to find the truth and I needed to find it fast. So I jumped headfirst into Orthodox Judaism. Um, Within the next 6 months, I had gotten on a plane. I had moved to Israel. I'd become a citizen. Um, and I was signed up to study in a seminary for Jewish women who grew up like unaffiliated and not religious. So it was like a seminary for newly observant Jewish women. And I was, um, I had always actually wanted to go to Israel. That was something
Mhm.
that was very important to me, and I had visited one time before, but I completely started over by moving there.
How was that? I'm very surprised. I was not expecting this. So, how was that experience? How long did you live there with these women?
I lived there about a year. I had planned on like never coming back. I had always, when a Jewish person moves to Israel, it's called making Aliyah. That's what I did. And I went to um, two different groups. I spent some time with, and it was in some ways, it was like some of the best times of my life. Because I had never been like on my own before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really on my own because when I moved to Israel, I didn't really have anyone there. Like, I mean, moving to another country on your own is a great, I mean, it was absolutely insane that I did that, but it ended up being a great experience for me. Um, the the groups I was a part of, they really were trying to show you the beauty of Jewish life and Jewish families. And coming from what was now a broken family because my parents had split, that was very attractive to me to see these families coming together, especially like we'd go and spend Shabbos with them on the Sabbath. Um, and it was beautiful. And I really, really wanted that. Most of the other young women at the seminary came from homes that were, they grew up Jewish, but they weren't religious. But I grew up like in some ways like super religious but of a different background. Um, so I couldn't really relate to them as much, but um, completely fell in love with living in Israel and took on all the observances of religious Orthodox Judaism very fast. When people heard my story, I was often asked to tell my story over dinner, because people are always interested to hear, like, how did you come to this understanding, especially from your
Mm-hmm.
background. Um, some people thought it was a little bit unbelievable, like that's really strange. How did how did that happen? But overall, I was very warmly welcomed. Um, partway through one of these programs I was on, I got an email. It was in December of 2006, I believe. I got an email from Andy, and he was the one I was previously engaged to. And he said, "I'm going to be in Jerusalem for a couple of weeks." He was a teacher at the time, and he was going to be there for his winter break. He was going to be studying at a yeshiva, which is like a men's school. And I'd love to meet up with you. And I was like, oh no, he's probably still somehow involved in all the Messianic Christian stuff. And I had completely left that behind. But I mean, I wanted to see a familiar face from home, and I was interested in catching up with him. So we ended up meeting. We met over by the Western Wall, which, if you've ever seen like pictures of like the old city of Jerusalem, like the big golden dome is there, and then there's a wall. It's very special to Jewish people. We met over there, and we ended up going out to coffee, and he explained that in the meantime he had converted to Orthodox Judaism. So we were more on the same page at that point. Now, he was teaching, so he was only there for a short time, and I had planned on never coming back to the US. So, I mean, I didn't see that working out, but it was kind of amazing how we had come full circle, and he wasn't converting for me, but he was on his own journey separately than me. And I was doing my own things, not for him this time, but because I was convinced of the truth of it. I want to back up a bit and say, one of the things they do is they put you through a seminar where they basically try to use different proof texts to prove that Judaism is true. In the Torah, the narrative is that God revealed himself to an entire nation of people, being the Jewish people, and that like you couldn't put a lie over on that many people. If there's millions of people, you couldn't possibly lie to that many people, and it could still exist to this day. So they that was one of the big ones. I'm no expert, but it's called the Kuzari argument. Anyhow, so I was 100% convinced in the truth of this. He was too. What ended up happening, my father got sick, and I ended up coming back to the United States for what I thought was just a couple of weeks, just to see how he was, just to be with him. It turns out it was not as serious as they thought, but that was how I got back. In the meantime, my mother said, you should probably call Andy. And I because she could see this all working out. But I couldn't, and because I was planning on going back to Israel. But anyway, I called him. I listened to my mom and called him. I was unsure because I just thought, what's the point? I'm about to go back to Israel. There's no point in calling him. But I did. And he was up there the next weekend. That next Sunday he was up, and we started dating again. Mm-hmm. It just kind of, it seemed as if it was absolutely meant to be. We had such a common background. We knew each other's families, and we were really on the same page, and it came full circle. So we ended up getting married that next December. So about a year after we met up again in Jerusalem, we got married. We lived in South Georgia. That's where he's from. For a little bit of time, but we knew we needed to get to the Orthodox community. That's one of the things about a community is super important, and to maintain a religious Jewish life, you really do want to be in that community for several different reasons. So we ended up moving to Atlanta, and we lived there for the next 8 or 9 years, and it was. My mother said, I don't want to be an Orthodox Jew myself, but I can tell it makes you happy. I can tell that this is a good thing for you. My favorite parts of living that life were definitely the community. I mean, it's almost like living in a little village inside of the city. I made some really good friends there. And the reason we ended up moving out had more to do with it's like super expensive to live in Atlanta, and the rent prices were going up and up and up. Um,
Yes.
but we lived there and got very very close with a lot of people in the community, the rabbis, and the we went to very involved with the synagogue. And um, the hardest thing for me during that time was we wanted to have children, and it just was not happening. Um, and so um, I just thought this is never going to be, and I was sad about it. I mean, most religious Jewish families they have a lot of kids, and all of the other people my age, most of them had kids, um, and I didn't, and I just kind of was quiet about it. But I was praying and praying and praying and praying, and felt like no one was listening, and so eventually, I got a call from a rabbi we had become close with, and he said, "I just want you to know that there are resources out there." And to make a long story short, someone, and I'll never know who this was. Someone anonymously came forward and said that they would cover our fertility treatments for
Oh,
us.
wow.
I I mean, that kind of generosity I just didn't know existed. Um, and it was a lot of working with rabbis and doctors and everything. But we eventually had our first daughter, and um, I mean, the Jewish community is not perfect, but one thing they do take care of each other, and that was, I mean, that was a kindness that I will never be able to repay. So we had our first daughter, and shortly after that, we moved because of my husband's job. We moved out near where you are, I believe. And I was teaching at the time. I was teaching elementary school, and my husband was teaching high school. And during that time, we ended up, it was a huge shock to find out we were pregnant with our second daughter without having to go through fertility treatments. And it was wonderful. Um, when we moved, I was kind of kicking and screaming. I did not want to leave the community. That was something that I felt like, oh, I finally have my people again. I have my place. I know what to believe. I felt like I had finally found that, and I felt like, oh, isn't it good to have all of those things settled before you have children? That way, you can tell them all the right things to do and all the right things to believe. So, but that didn't work out. So we ended up um, just keeping, when because we didn't drive, we would, the Sabbath is something we have every single week. I'm, made big family meals and everything, and it's a day we turn our phones off all day. We don't drive. We're now if we lived in the community, we could go to people's homes and things like that. But we were out on our own, not in a Jewish area, so we would just stay home. Um, I do a lot, as much as you can with little kids. I read a lot on those days. But it was, and my husband would do all the prayers, which normally you would do with a group, but he would do them on his own. And that's how we were. We eventually made another move. My husband always wanted to be a university professor, so we ended up moving one more time. We're still in Georgia, just a different area. And it was not too long after that 2020 happened, and just I don't know. I think that being isolated gave a lot of us time to think and
Hmm.
reevaluate. And I don't know. I can't, I would like to do this, but I haven't pinpointed where it all started for me. But I really started to question things then. Back the first time I went through, I feel like I've gone through like two phases of deconstruction at this point in my life. The first time I felt when I realized, oh, Jesus can't be the Messiah, I never thought to question God. I gave up the belief in Christianity, but of course there's a God, so I never questioned that. Um, and then the second go round, that's what I started to question. And I can't even put my finger on what started it. It was probably a lot of YouTube channels and a lot of podcasts that I listened to and books that I was reading. I didn't want to admit it to myself for a long time, but I was becoming increasingly frustrated. Um, Once I started allowing myself to think think about certain things that I was hearing on these podcasts and reading about, um, I started looking at the scripture through a new lens, and certain things started to bother me. I started to have ethical issues with some of the things I was reading in the Torah, and that was really surprising to me because I guess you look at certain people as, oh, these are the heroes of our faith. This is Moses and this is David. And while I didn't look at them, I mean, I didn't think they were perfect people by any means, and that really isn't emphasized in Judaism. Well, in certain aspects, certain circles, they can do no wrong. But I started having real issues with certain things, and one of my pet issues is when the narrative is Moses is taking the Jewish people um, through the land and commanding genocide, and that how in the world could there's really nothing you can say to justify that, although people have tried. People have tried. I've listened to Christians try to justify it. I've heard John Piper try to justify it by saying, if anything God does is good, and so that's it.
You just have to believe that. Like we're just the clay and he's the potter and all that stuff. We can't question. Yeah.
Right. Right. Um, anyway, that was and still is a big issue for me. And I mean, I can go. There's lots of other stories, but those types of things are things I struggled with. And then just the problem of evil is that for me is the big one. How could an all powerful, all good God, who all knowing God, not answer? I mean, my prayers were to have a child, which for me was important, but certainly there's more important prayers out there that he was also ignoring. Um, that really, really bothered me. And I kind of kept all of this to myself for a while. I had little kids. I didn't have like a close friend group. When I did meet some friends, like this was not something that we were going to be talking about over coffee or anything. So the only one I really opened up to was my husband, and he I don't know. I think he realized the direction I was going in before I realized it, and he even said, "I don't think you believe in God." And I said, "What are you talking about? Of course I do." And he's like, "No." He could see it, and I could not admit this to myself for the longest time, and he it's been it's been interesting. Thank goodness he's very patient. He's very understanding. We can have open conversations about these things. Not to say that they aren't hard conversations, but we can talk about it and we're open with each other. And he has a great sense of humor. I mean, we laugh about stuff. He'll call me a heretic all the time and stuff like that. So I think a sense of humor is healthy about these types of things. So about a week ago, I was like, I've got to tell him I'm gonna talk to Arlene, and he's like, the whole idea of me publicly saying anything was a little scary for him. And so then he started listening to the podcast a bit, and he said, "These sound like really nice people."
Oh,
like,
wow! Yay!
because the term atheist gets such a bad rap.
Yeah.
I've been listening to you guys for well over a year and other podcasts as well. And so I've kind of gotten over it. But, just that's it's a scary word. And he just is like, oh, okay. Not to really, he's got a real amazing story himself, but
Mm-hmm.
he admits, he's like, I guess everyone's agnostic. So he's like, I guess I'm an agnostic theist. Whereas
Yeah.
I'm kind of coming out on the other side of that.
So where are you now?
Yeah. I can no longer believe, and there was not like one day where it all happened for me, but
Mhm.
to me, belief is just not a choice. You either do or you don't. And I no longer, I cannot believe. Um, I have to say that it has been amazing for my mental health to give up belief, to stop praying. It was very hard when I talk about praying, I'm talking about like personal prayer. In Judaism, you also have praying from a prayer book and things like that, which I never really got super. I didn't get a lot from that, honestly, but personal prayer I certainly did, and I don't know. It's just been I feel a lot of freedom, and I felt like I had a lot of anger I was holding on to. I was very angry at God for a while because I still believed in him. And once I realized that I no longer did, I got to let go of all that anger that I was holding on to. And I feel like it's done wonders for me. I feel happier. And and I can handle, I mean, there's a lot of bad, evil things in this world, but I can almost handle knowing that, but knowing that someone created evil, which the Bible literally says that God created good and evil in the book of
Yes.
Isaiah. Knowing that someone, or believing that someone created that and is watching that and is unwilling to help that, but says that he's all powerful and then demands worship. I can't get behind that anymore.
No, absolutely. As a Christian, I was taught that like without God, like how do you explain things? How do you find meaning and all that stuff? But really it's like all the evil stuff that happens, I would much rather it just be shitty things happen. It's arbitrary. There isn't a reason. It just really sucks. And
Mhm.
humans do the best we can to make the best out of situations and to help one another. And that has, for me as well, just been easier than
Mhm.
trying to make it make sense and have meaning and all that.
Right.
As we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked that you wanted to talk about that I didn't get to?
Sorry if I've been a bit rambly. It's just going through, it's almost like sometimes when I think back on everything, I'm like almost like reliving it real quick. So sometimes I get lost in my thoughts. So thank you for being patient with me. But the other thing that I just wanted to bring up was raising children when you don't have all the answers has been has been eye opening. And right now I have a 5 and an 8 year old, and my 5 year old and 8 year old ask some really hard questions.
Yes.
And we talk about these things. And I knew the day was going to come when they asked me this but anyway, it came a few weeks ago when we were about to, and by the way, I'm still keeping Shabbos. I'm still keeping kosher. I'm living a traditional Jewish life while also realizing that I don't believe anymore. And so I'm in a kind of a weird place and probably a transitional place. And I am not sure where we're going to be in a year. But I'm, we'll do it all together. And I just wanted to be open. I'm not going to lie to my children. Um, but I also want them to have their own journeys as well. And so anyway, my 5 year old actually, she said, and we call God Hashem. It's a traditional Jewish way of saying God. She said, I just don't think Hashem is real. I said, really? What makes you say that? Because I'm not pushing this on my
Yeah, you
kids.
want them to explain
Mhm.
and you want to hear like what their thoughts are because they're probably way different than what we think they're going to be. Go ahead.
So she just says, he just seems too magical. I think he's just magical. And I just don't think that that's a real thing. And I was like, oh, I said, well, it's okay. You're allowed to think whatever you want. And, oh, okay. So then I got through that first conversation. And then we had a few more variations of that conversation with my 8-year-old. And then my 8-year-old just said, do you believe in Hashem? And it was so direct. And I
Yeah.
couldn't
Yeah.
put her off anymore. And I just looked at my husband and I was like, no. And her eyes got real big. And my husband was like, well, I think she's going through a lot right now and everyone questions things in their lives and blah blah blah. He was trying to soften it a little bit, but I was able to just say no.
Hmm.
And it was like a burden off my shoulders. I could
Yeah.
be honest with my kids um and it's not like I know some people who have come to this conclusion and overnight like they stop keeping the traditions of Judaism. That's not going to happen with our family. Like it's just too much of who we are, and there is a lot of value in tradition. Um, One of the books that and authors that I really like is Sasha Sagan.
Yeah.
Um, and if you read her book, she'll talk about humans' need for ritual, and that there are benefits to this type of thing. How much I'm going to do this, that remains to be seen.
Yeah.
We're not sure yet. One of our current struggles is it better for us to go to a synagogue so that our kids are at least around other Jewish kids sometimes, or is it better for us to stay home and uh, just keep on doing what we've been doing? And we haven't really come to a conclusion
Hmm.
yet. But it is important for us to pass on these traditions to our kids. It's part of their story, part of their family story. Um, but for me, like I no longer, I can no longer believe this, and so um, I guess you would, if I had to label myself, it would also be agnostic atheist.
Yeah. And that's one of the beauties of being outside of very firm beliefs is you don't have to have a label. Like it's sometimes easier if someone asks and you can give a label, but like you don't have to have answers. You don't have to have it all figured out. And thinking about your kids and what will observing different rituals look like your kids will evolve, you guys will evolve, your family will evolve, and you can keep what you guys love and throw out the stuff that you don't love, and it'll change in 5 years when your kids are older and they're not interested, or maybe they are interested. It's nice to just have freedom, like you said earlier.
That's right.
So you mentioned Sasha Sagan. Do you have any book, podcasts, any recommendations for our listeners that have been helpful to you?
Um, Gosh, I read a lot. I wish I had written down a list. I like to read different religious memoirs. I've read, there's a lot of, in addition to a lot of the ones that, like, anytime someone recommends a book on your podcast, I'll immediately like jot it down and
Yep, I understand.
put it on hold at the library because I'm a library person. But
Yay.
I, there's one called Heretic, and um, I can give you the name in a minute because it's on my shelf. That one, a life changing book for me. A lot of people mention this on your podcast is *Sapiens* by Yuval
Yes.
Noah Harari, um, also an Israeli. Amazing writer. I want to read all of his other books as well. But I also read the graphic novel version of that, and that was pretty cool.
Yes, we use that in our homeschool for history because
Yes.
it's so well done.
Yes. Since my kids are pretty little, I haven't actually read these books yet, but I did put them on hold at the library, and I'll buy them if they don't come in soon. There's the Annabelle and Aiden series. Have you heard of that? It's a children's series.
We are bookish. I'm a snob when it comes to books. And so, in my personal opinion, I'm sure they needed more money to make them better, but try them out and let me know what you think because
Okay.
I was not impressed. I like the idea behind
Okay.
the books.
Okay.
And then, go ahead.
That's okay. No, but that's something I'd like to check out because my kids like a lot of, especially my oldest, really is into books that she's into nonfiction like I am. She wants to kind of know what's going on in the world. So anyway, books to be able to start conversations would be things I'm looking for in the future. A podcast. There was a short-lived podcast that's still available, although they're not recording anymore, called Born Again, and it was one couple's deconstruction journey, and it's there's I think there's a Facebook group that goes along with it as well. That was really, really good, and yeah, I can give you a list if you want.
Okay, yeah, between now and the release. Well, Mandi, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time out to tell your story.
Thank you for having me.
My final thoughts on Mandi's episode. I think the biggest thing that jumped out to me is first, how complex it must have been to try to make some form of Judaism plus Jesus plus just living in the United States without many different Jewish communities you could be a part of, and trying to make all of that work. The mental gymnastics it took for me to make Calvinism work, just evangelical Christianity in general, but having just all of that just seemed like so much. And the frustration when questions are dismissed. And that just seems to be part of any fundamentalist religious experience. You just can't ask questions. If you ask questions, it becomes too much for the people in charge, even if it's just the Bible study leader. And it's not someone with a lot of power at the top of the church or the temple or synagogue. And maybe it's just because it becomes frustrating because they don't have the answers and they just need you to be quiet so that they don't have to think about and critically examine what they believe. I don't know. It makes me curious what all's underneath that. But the biggest thing that jumped out to me was when she said belief is not a choice. Like you can't choose to believe something that you're convinced is not true. I can't suddenly believe that Santa Claus is real. I just can't. And yeah, once you realize, lots of people who've been on the show have talked about, like, it wasn't that they set out to stop believing. It's just suddenly they realize, I don't believe, even if it's just part of their religious beliefs. They can't force themselves to believe that part. And then, of course, the unraveling begins. And for some, it's overnight, and for some, it takes years and years. And like she said, it feels like she had 2 different phases of deconstruction. But it's beautiful to see where Mandi is now and the freedom, the better mental health, just feeling better, feeling happier, finding joy when we're told a lot. I don't know about in Judaism, but I know in Christianity, we're told a lot that you just can't find joy. You can't find hope. You can't find any of those things. And so it's wonderful to see her on this side, finding joy and happiness and being open to whatever the future holds for her family. It's wonderful. So, man, thank you again for being on the show.
The secular grace thought of the week is be bad at fooling yourself. One of my favorite quotes from Richard Feynman that we quote all the time is, the first principle is not to fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. I bring this up because I've just noticed a few occasions outside of the context of religion where the same process of being in a bubble and having an apologetic around the topic keeps people from seeing the untruths. One of these that continues to bother me and has over the years is what is sometimes called the heterodox sphere, and it is the group of intellectuals who assert that they know more than the scientific community, more than the public health community, more than the government in particular. And from my perspective, the people who listen to these people are just as much in a bubble as your typical evangelical Christian. The point of this is to say that even if you have deconstructed, even if you have deconverted, that does not mean that you are incapable of fooling yourself. Here's the thing, though. You're better at recognizing when you are fooling yourself now. When you are worried about not being considered a part of the community because you have different opinions, that's the big red flag. And be willing to investigate and find the truth wherever it lays. All right. I actually don't know what is going to come up next week. I'm considering doing a solo episode. We may run another Arlene interview. I want to thank all of you who have reached out to me saying that you'd like to be interviewed. I very much want to get to you all. I have to point out that right now my work schedule has been really demanding, and that's the reason why it's taken me a while to get back to everyone. Please be patient. I will try to get to you all. All of that to say that I don't know what's coming up next week. So until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.